And we'll go ahead and get started. So we're very fortunate to have Steve Petrovic from University of Cincinnati to join us. Steve is going to be discussing compensation planning and productivity. What we will do is mute everyone while Steve is presenting. If you do have questions while the presentation is ongoing, you can either make notes and ask at the end or utilize the chat functionality there at the bottom in the middle. And then we will have a Q&A session after Steve's presentation. Kirsten, am I forgetting anything?
Nope, sounds good to me, Travis. I'm really excited that we're able to have this session, and I'm glad to see all of you here that were able to make it. So without further ado, let us proceed with Steve Petrovic.
Thanks, Kirsten. Thanks, Travis, as well for doing this. Thank you for everyone attending. We much rather would have done this in California, but such is life. So I wanted to go through compensation planning and productivity at a very high level. Obviously, each institution is different, so there is going to be nuances of this which can absolutely not work at some institutions, and there's a lot more flexibility at others. So we're going to go over it at a really high level, and then I left time at the end, I hope, to really discuss some very specific questions to each individual that we could really get to and see what options you might have at your institution. So as me and my boss always say, there's only two things in this world, and that's time and money, and everything else people don't really care about. When you're an administrator, when you're a chair, those are the two biggest decisions that you really make, is how much time somebody gets and how much money that they get. Everything else kind of relates to those two and is a decision. And what we know about our faculty and our APPs are most of them want that. And when I say that, I mean both. And they realize that that is not always an opportunity, so you have to work through it. I apologize if I'm not looking directly at the camera. I got 3 screens up with my little COVID command center, so I'm trying to keep an eye on everyone there. So time, as all you guys know, time is measured by work RVUs at most institutions, and that is what productivity is measured under with time and how productive you're being. They also understand that in the subspecialty of emergency medicine, you really do have to take into consideration the type of shifts as well as the time of shifts in that staffing makeup. If you're a night ranger, you are, no matter how many hours that you work, the same as a daytime clinician, you're probably not going to have as many work RVUs as your daytime colleague. Likewise, if you work primarily at the shop downtown and you have a bunch of residents, or if you have a bunch of APPs, because of Incident 2 type billing, you might have a different amount of productivity as well, yet you still have to manage, and depending on your department's staffing requirements of staffing patients with APPs or not, you still might have a lot of work to do, but you don't receive as many work RVU credits. And that's important for the administrator to really have an understanding of, because when you're having these discussions with your senior leadership of whether it's the college, your faculty practice plan, or your health system, because we all have different people we have to report up to, having that nuance and that understanding is key to help advocate for your faculty. It's also helpful that if you have to be on the other side of that and have a crucial conversation with one of your clinicians, that you know the kind of the comparisons, who you can compare against, some of their colleagues, so they can't use just, well, I work at nights, as a blanket excuse of why they're not being productive. There is people that you can compare against. So how we do this is that we use the CPSC benchmarks at our institution. Used to be called, as the previous slide showed, it used to be called, it was Vizian, it was FPS, it was all these different things. It keeps changing. But this is what we utilize. We have a scorecard by provider. It shows not only their FTE, which is in the top left corner that is circled, but it also shows their clinical FTE. If they have education, if they're the program director, for this example, this is our program director, because I tried to pick somebody that was right around the 50th percentile. 35% of her time is bought down as being the program director of our residency. That means that 65% of her is clinical. Then it shows how many work RVUs she makes. They adjust those because of FTE adjusted, and they say, okay, at 9,000, roughly 9,000 RVUs FTE adjusted, that puts her at the 51st percentile. It also shows how tight the window is that is circled by that benchmark of emergency medicine, because you can understand that in subspecialties, 1,000 work RVUs could push you maybe 10, 15 percentiles. In other subspecialties, 1,000 work RVUs might push you 25 or 30 percentiles. And just knowing how tight that window is very helpful.
Steve, I'm sorry, I interrupt a lot, so I apologize.
No, I know that about you.
One thing I want to point out to everyone that's an important distinction: a lot of academic medical centers have historically used Vizient, FPSC, all of these iterative names that they've had as their Bible. That is because back in the day, this was a tool of the AAMC, and it was only information from academic medical centers. The reason that Vizient has changed the name from FPSC to the CPSC is they have now started utilizing community and non-academic shops in their data. And so that is a big distinction for you to make sure that your chairs understand, and also that your hospital and practice plan leadership groups understand. This is no longer just a clean academic consortium of data.
You're 100% right. We saw that, and we learned the hard way. The 50th percentile and the comparisons changed significantly over the last few years, not only in emergency medicine, but I think many of you probably also have intensivists that work as part of your faculty. And what we do is the intensivist benchmarks are so much different than an emergency medicine benchmark, that if you are an intensivist and you work at all in the ICU, we put you under an intensivist comparison group. And for a period of time, it was a little dirty trick, but it made you look fantastic because you had a little bit of emergency medicine time in there, and that would just kill work RVUs. The problem was, as we put more people in, as more community sites came in, those benchmarks went up pretty rapidly and pretty significantly. This is also a tool that our clinicians really enjoy because they get to look at kind of what their numbers look like. As with most physicians, they are they're pretty used to being really good at everything that they've done in their whole careers, and they like being the best, and they want to see where they are at compared to where we think they should be at. Sometimes they don't understand some of the limiters of this, mainly working with the APP colleagues. What we do at our institution, we have incident 2 type billing. If we have a physician who is staffing a patient with an APP, at our institution, we have made the ruling that the faculty member will receive the charges and the payment credit, but the APP will receive the work RVU credit. By doing that, it really proves the value of the APP, which at our institution is key because our health system was really, at one point, really focused on cutting back on APPs. And in the emergency department, where we actually use them to bill, not just for care coordination, like a lot of the inpatient services, we explained that that would destroy our clinical practice and it would just slow everything down. By doing the incident 2 type billing, we're able to show, in their world, 3,500 work RVUs per APP was considered that they were being very productive. As an entity in our group, we had over 28 APPs, and they averaged over 4,200 work RVUs per clinical FTE, which are far surpassed any other subspecialty. And it was because of that our COO of our faculty practice plan has now become one of the biggest supporters of us to continue to have APPs, and they see that as a value as opposed to an additional cost. Anything else before I move on with this document? Okay, great.
So, yeah, Steve, sorry, there's one other question. Does the CPSC take volume into account, or does the benchmark work fairly well for any and all ED sizes?
So I think it doesn't take volume into account as a subset. I think what it does is, obviously, as us as administrators and our chairs, we have to identify what our staffing makeup is. So I think that's the biggest thing that it takes into account is if you have more faculty in this, no matter if you're a 70,000 visit shop or if you're a 120,000 visit shop, the amount of patients that that individual is going to see is going to adjust. So I think it's constantly looking at that. So this won't adjust because you're a busy shop. It'll only adjust because of the patients that you see. It's our jobs as administrators to advocate for the amount of patients that our faculty see per hour. And that's usually the numbers that we're looking at is how many patients per hour, and that's new patients, understanding that the amount of patients add up because of the lifespan of each patient. Okay. So that's really time at an extremely high level. The next thing is money. So at money, we're talking about compensation measured by total compensation, and we'll get to the breakdown of what that means. And that is compared to AAMC. As Travis stated, AAMC is king at academic centers. There's obviously also MGMA, and there's now is it AAMG or AAGM? It's the third one that they kind of utilize that has kind of a hybrid between them. That our full disclosure, our CEO of our health system used to be the CEO or the senior vice president of AAMC, so now Vizient, in Chicago. He came to us and started doing that. So he's very interested to see what Vizient does because his friends are still there. And then we kind of go with that. I think it's AAGA or MA or whatever. So that was really what we compare ourselves against. The dean, on the other hand, is always looking at AAMC, does not look at any other comparison group. And our dean and our compensation is done through the college and our faculty practice plan. While the health system is very involved in paying for all those bills, the dean and the practice plan are the ones who define compensation. And that is a very strong line that we don't cross in our institution.
And you'll see the MGMA numbers and these Vizient numbers are oftentimes very different, especially with regards to productivity. One distinction to understand is that even though MGMA does have an academic subset, all MGMA data is self-reported. And so there is a possibility for human error or misinterpretation, whereas information that goes through Vizient and through their CPSC is all generally a direct feed from your billing system. If you have Epic, it's a direct feed from Epic. So it is oftentimes seen by leadership groups as being the more reliable source.
Absolutely. So when you're talking about faculty, you're talking about money, there's usually 4 types of people. And at one point, our COO of our faculty practice plan, who's a non-clinician, an administrator, put this up. And I kind of laughed at this. And there was pictures and there was workhorses and like fat cows and all this stuff. And everyone wanted to be a fat cow. But if you're a fat cow, you got to be careful because they might cut you. So in the top left, you're in golden handcuffs. You're paid very high from a compensation rate, but you have a very low productivity benchmark. Then you have the people that can't cover their costs. They're not really productive, but you don't pay them that much, so you don't really know what to do with them. And as long as they kind of stay under that, is that okay? Is that not okay? There's franchise players who get paid a ton and work a ton. A lot of times based on compensation plans, orthopedic surgeons usually have comp plans that incentivize this behavior. You can make a lot of money, you just have to do a lot of work RVUs and cut all the time. Emergency medicine, a lot tougher for this to happen because of the fact that we define their hours and we can't define who comes in and what payer mix. And then the last one is flight risks. Flight risks are obviously our biggest concern is because they work extremely hard clinically, but they're not compensated well. So they probably have the opportunity to either lower the amount that they're working clinically or improve the amount that they're making from a compensation standpoint. So what we did here at Cincinnati was we started to graph this and graph all of our clinicians. So what we saw was as a totality, our subspecialty was flight risks. And it made sense. We were constantly losing faculty members when I first arrived 6 years ago to other institutions, both on a national and regional stage. And when I say regional, I mean academic, but I mean Chicago, Columbus, Indiana, and Kentucky, because they can still stay somewhat local, but they can make more or work less. And it's really good to understand kind of where as a group you stand. It also is good to understand where each individual stands, because you're never going to have everyone in one group. You're always going to have people who make a little bit more. You're always going to have people who work a little and are a little bit less productive and more productive, but you kind of want to understand where your group is. Because when we did this and my chairman had his reappointment, one of the things that he stated, and it was at the time that there was a lot of academic chair positions that were open, and he was being recruited heavily for a number of them. They didn't know that he wasn't going anywhere. I did, but he was stating, we have an opportunity to show this data to our system leadership and push. So what we got was, over a 3-year period, they were able to increase our base salaries, because we knew we couldn't get multiple millions of dollars in 1 year. We did it over 3 years and we increased it. And we did the first year, we increased with compensation. The second year, we extended the amount of faculty that we hired, which lowered everyone's clinical hours. And then the third year, we increased their salaries again. So we did a hybrid approach about moving both of these numbers, trying to be in the center. If you work at the 50th percentile and you make around the 50th percentile, people are usually happy. And what a lot of administrators find is, once you hit certain compensation marks, an extra $10,000 compared to a few hours off, most clinicians, depending on their background, actually lean towards the time, because the actual value that you're getting from just an extra $10, $15, $20,000 when you're making $200,000+ a year isn't the same as being an academician and saying, I just really want more time to do my projects and do this and do that. So it's just really interesting to understand how people like that and what drives your faculty. So comp plans, you got to know the rules, because every institution, there are rules that are inherent of what you're allowed to do. Other places, if you have your own faculty, if you're your own foundation. So back in the day at Brown, I don't know if there was any very specific things that you were allowed to or not allowed to do, but my assumption was Dr. Zink and Kirsten could say, this is what we're doing, and as long as the financials of their institution worked, it would work. At other places, you're at a faculty practice plan where it's rough. Just as long as you meet your addendum in your comp plan, and as long as you sit in those guidelines, you're fine. At other institutions, it's very clear. It says, we pay everyone at the 50th percent of AAMC for the rank. You get this much money for these other things, and we change only based on rank. We do not change based on anything else. So before you start a whole process of seeing what you're able to do, you should first know what the rules are, because that will save you a ton of time. So what drives comp? So for the most part in emergency medicine, in my opinion, it's a lot about hours coverage drives comp. But there are some variations to that. We know our USACS colleagues and some of our other colleagues who are more pushing towards that performance benchmarking. They're looking at productivity. They're looking at a work RVU complement. They say, here's your base salary. And maybe they put that at the 30th percentile of AAMC, but you can work up to the 50th or 60th percentile AAMC based on your either the type of shifts you work or the productivity that you get while you're working those shifts. Some institutions, Cleveland Clinic is a great example, they pay really high base salaries. The reason they do that is they have more people actually on their campus in their ED, because they want their patient satisfaction scores to be some of the top. They say, take the extra time to sit down and talk to the patient, have a good conversation with them. We will pay for that because we want our patient satisfaction to be so high. And then also other places look at the quality and safety components. How many, what's your sepsis compliance rate, even though that we all know that sepsis compliance benchmark is next to impossible to actually get to 90% approved. But that's a big thing, as well as other safety like falls or time and restraints and things like that. Understanding what the health system, what the college, what the faculty practice plan holds dear. There are times where you can align your compensation with whether that's a citizenship component, whether that's a variable component or anything like that. You can align it to the goals that they're pushing towards, which will not only help your faculty earn extra funding, but it will also help your leadership team and your chair to be seen as bought into the priorities of your institution. So if that's an option, that's always something to look at. And how can you try to push your faculty to kind of be aligned with the goals of everyone else when they say, what can I do on my 12-hour shift or my 10-hour shift? Well, if you do this, you get to see exact results and you do better as an institution and a department. So comp plans, I will be very clear. I stole this unabashedly from Jim's presentation of the data, as well as a few others. We put these together based on the 2019 meeting, because obviously we thought we were going to do this in Palm Springs. So all of this is about a year behind, but I think most of it holds pretty close to being true. So as we all talk, there's different components. There's a single component structure, which is a salary only. I think a lot of us are kind of moving away from that. It's very small for MDs, and we'll have this on the next slide. That's 3% of all MDs are on a single component metric. It just isn't the way we do things anymore. There's a 2-component metric where it goes the base plus the extra hours and the stipend. That is going to be 23% of all MDs are on that, 38% overall, because our APP colleagues, it is easier to have just a 2-component. They can't actually control as much. They're really mostly clinicians. The 3-component, which is base plus extras plus either the stipend, the bonus, or a stipend and bonus plus base, that's now 35%. And amazingly, now at a 4-component base, extra, stipend, and bonus, people are at 39%. Now that's 11% of everyone, 39% of MDs, because I don't actually think it would be close to possible for our APP colleagues to have a 4-component structure with that. But as you can see, there is no right answer. I think the single component might be the wrong answer, but the 2, 3, and 4, it's just dependent on your institution. It's really understanding what incentivizes people to get the reactions and the output that you're looking for. It also shows what kind of financials. If you look at the 2, 3, and 4 component, the delta between those is less than $17,000 from a total compensation perspective. It's all about how you break those out. So it's very tight with that elasticity, but it really allows you to kind of drive performance how you would like it. And really what kind of your chair, what kind of your health system and your faculty practice plan is looking for. I'll pause here for any questions, because this stuff is kind of the skeleton that you kind of build all compensation off of.
So the one other thing I would add is that a lot of what Steve has talked about is what is predominantly used in that faculty have a base salary that is predominantly premised on their academic rank. And then there's sort of a target number of hours that those faculty have, and then you buy down from those hours. So that if you're a core faculty member, you get a buy down. If you're a medical director, you get a buy down. And that's the way that I would say most shops compensate their faculty. There are places out there, mine being one of them, that in recognition that different faculty value time and others value money, give each individual faculty member the ability to craft their compensation package as it relates to the roles they wish to have and the number of hours they wish to work. And so I might have an assistant professor, you know, making 220,000, and I might have another one with the same years of experience making $420,000. And that's because they have different roles, they have different administrative roles, they might be working double the number of hours. They, you know, if we looked at their FTE, they might be considered a 1.6 FTE. So there are definitely different ways to structure this. And, you know, it's just, as Steve was saying, it's all all depends on what your institution will allow and what they want to incentivize as a part of their program.
Right.
I think, sorry, Kirsten.
So I think one of the other things I know when I was at Brown, one of the things that we allowed was people to reduce their salary to get rid of something that they didn't want to do. They could reduce their salary to reduce their nights. There were restrictions around that. You had to be over a certain age, had to be on the faculty for a certain amount of time, but you could basically buy out of your nights. And then there were some other things. So we did have some people who were doing that. And so when I would fill out the salary survey, I was putting a negative amount in the stipend column. It always came up as a question, but that was truly what it was, because their base salary was X, whether it was 300,000 or whatever, and then they had this negative adjustment because they had reduced something that was undesirable. So I think, you know, these comp plans are pretty complex, and there's many, many models out there.
And while it's not an absolute, I think, you know, because I, before being at Northwestern, spent 9 years at a state institution. And so I'm looking at Kirsten at Brown and me at Northwestern, and then my experience at a state institution. And I will tell you that probably in general, you have more flexibility when you're at some of these quote unquote private places as opposed to ones that are more affiliated with government.
Absolutely.
I'm looking at Rio. I'm looking at Rio when I say that.
Just to remind you guys, if anybody has a question, you are all muted, but you can ask it by using the chat function, which if you scroll down to the bottom of your screen is right in the center. If you have Steve's presentation up and visible to you. So feel free to type in the chat window, and then Travis and I will make sure that your questions get answered.
Yeah, to Kirsten and Travis's point, I completely agree with that. You know, based on the institution makeup, also based on how old the subspecialty is at your institution. There are a lot of places where, you know, emergency medicine is either just turned out of a division, still potentially in a division, where you might not have as much. UC was one of the first residency programs in the country. So we have been a department for many, many years, and we're actually seen at our institution as one of the leading departments. Our CMO is an emergency medicine physician. 3 of the ACMOs are emergency medicine physicians, and our chair is also on the board of directors for the health system. So we get to do things that aren't the same at other institutions. And we know that. We have a lot of friends who are chairs that went through our residency program who are chairs at other institutions. We have, I think, currently like 22. And we talked to some of those people that we're still friends with, and they were like, oh, I didn't realize how easy it was here because we were allowed to do this. Because we're a new subspecialty, they were looking at everything so closely, they only allow us to do this very specific comp plan to start with. So I think it's all about understanding what drives and understanding what that the institution, the health system, the practice plan, whomever, what the output that they could get from you adjusting yours and making that argument in a way that not only are your faculty winning because there's a little bit more variation allowed, but also sometimes the institution will be able to win because you can incentivize the behaviors that they would like to see potentially. All right, keep moving. So Travis mentioned this before, and I wanted to mention it because there are a lot of institutions. It's really tied to your AAMC benchmarks and your rank. So your academic rank of based on what years you are and kind of what that mean salary by rank started with. So as you can see here, this was 2019 presentation. So that means up to 2018 data. And as you can see here, that as you increase, the instructor and assistant professor is actually really close. Each individual institution identifies as, first of all, do they use the instructor title and how they utilize it, but also a lot of times that's very similar to an assistant professor at other institutions. Some people start as assistant professors, some groups start as instructors, but it just basically, in a lot of our time, it means when you first start off, you're going to be working very heavily most of the time in clinical, and how are you going to be funded? Then as you see an associate, it only climbs to $30,000, $32,000, but what it doesn't show is how much you're actually working clinically as well. So it's both time and money. So there could be somebody who's an associate professor who works a ton, who can make way more than these numbers, or they could work a lot less but make less, or somewhere in the middle. And I think that's really important, especially in emergency medicine, which is such a burnout subspecialty, that you do have to realize that there is a little focus on the time, because people that work clinically for their whole careers without differentiating themselves, by the age of 55, there is a large majority that face that burnout mentality. And how do they continue to get to the point of retirement and still be able to work clinically, especially if they've worked and been paid extremely well by working so many clinical hours, and they have that high lifestyle? How do you manage that out? And that's always something, as an administrator, that everyone wants to be paid very high, but then over time they're like, well, can I cut back my hours? And if you have nothing else in your roles, how do you cut back your hours and still keep that high pay? It's really challenging. And that's where I think the discussion with your chair, if there's a vice chair that's a specific in mentorship or academic advancement, or, kind of planning out what a career path looks like, that's really key. So move on to roles. So as I stated, as you move on with your career, the roles bring in outside funding most of the time. And when outside funding is brought in, there's two options for it. Just like Travis stated at Northwestern, you could be the medical director at Northwestern, and that gives you X number of dollars that is associated with it. And if you still want to work the same amount of clinical hours and you're doing a great job as the medical director, you can do that. But at other institutions, it automatically means if you're funded 50% as your role, your 50% of your clinical stipend is then cut. And does that affect the hours that are brought down? And that really, you have to understand how people handle that. So a few of the averages, the means and medians that we use: clinical hours without an administrative duty, nationally, it looked like a little bit over 1,100 hours. If you had a administrative duty, you're about 200 hours less. So it's very important. So that's a little bit of the time. And then obviously the money, it's close to $30,000 difference, $31,000 difference between your salary if you don't have any administrative duties versus salary with administrative duties, because it's outside funding. Most of the time that funding is increased with cost of living. So that keeps up, where a lot of times, depending on where your specific geography is, there could be a change with Medicare, Medicaid, patient mix, anything like that, where you actually work the same amount of hours, but there's actually less revenue coming in. So that's important to also be aware of. Also, we look at everything we look at with keeping an eye on the gender disparity gap. Administrative duties, 72% of administrative duties as of the 2019 survey, which was on 2018, was male, and 28% there female. So it's really important to know, because when you look at all this, what we highlighted was that there is a group who their clinical hours are very low and their pay is extremely high. And how does that all work with the documents, and how does that work with compensation, of saying, okay, you work a little and you get paid a lot? And most of the time what we talk about is that's the senior leadership of the department, vice chair, chairs, whatnot. Okay. So for me, this is the things to keep an eye on when you're doing compensation, when you're having a discussion with this. There's implicit bias. We have a vice chair of diversity, and she also does kind of inclusion, and she had all the faculty and myself, because I was there at the faculty retreat. We all did implicit bias training. We all went through and did all the clicking, and you go really fast, so you're going and you're not actually thinking about what you're trying to do. And all of us at some point have implicit bias. Obviously, I put all these slides together before everything that happened in Minneapolis, but I mean, I think it's come to the forefront of everything that we talk about, that everyone has biases, and you have to be very clear about that before you start looking at time and money, because they can come out very quickly. blinded salaries and hours reviews. I do this with my senior leadership team all the time. I put together 2 clinicians, one who I know is super challenging, always is pushing the envelope, always trying to manipulate something, always doing that, and then I put it against somebody else. And what we do is we say, take a look at this. Do you think this is fair? It's like, kind of when you look at, during March Madness, they look at like blinded rosters. This is what this team did. They might not have a big name. They might not know who it is. Who would you put in the tournament? We do the same thing at our institution. We look at things and we want to make sure that based on just the merits, nothing else, does this look right? The other thing is sometimes you can't compare a faculty member to a faculty member. How are you going to compare the medical director of our academic shop that sees 80,000 visits to our medical director of a community shop that only sees 35,000 visits? Yeah, the hours probably are different. The pay looks different, all that kind of stuff. Well, that's where this survey is so helpful. You can go into the survey, go into the detail and say, let me look at all these medical directors for this many years out of residency, who are at associate professor, who are male or female, who have this kind of, or that are in the Midwest. And we can show how are we comparing against our like groups to make sure that we are being accurate and fair to everyone without just being like, wow, I really like Johnny or I really like Susie and I really want to help them out. Take the feelings out of it and really look at it based on the merit and the roles that they're doing. And that's, to us, is key. The other thing that we did at our institution is based on your training and based on whether if you did a fellowship or not, how long the fellowship was, what type of fellowship it was, we have a starting salary. And that starting salary is gender doesn't matter. If you went through this program and it was a 2-year program and you're either an intensivist or you're this, we look at that and we say, you are now going to start and make X amount of money. We did that because what we were seeing was that there was variation in our responses back to Jim and the benchmark committee. And we were really focused on that because my chair and our vice chair for diversity was like, we want to be a focus of that there isn't gender disparity because of where the starting points are. We understand that when you start your academic career, things change. Life changes. We have a few faculty members, both male and female, who have significant others who are also physicians. Because of that, they are able to make decisions of how many clinical hours, to Travis's point, that they want to work because it fits well with their lifestyle. But when, just like Kirsten had to send in a negative stipend amount to get that amount down to the benchmark committee, I had to explain to Kathy Harbertson why one of my new hires was making so much less than all these male counterparts. And I was like, I am so sorry. I didn't explain to this. Even though we kept her at a 1.0 FTE based on benefits, her clinical FTE was only a 0.6. And when we adjusted that with FTE and the pay and everything else, it fell right in line. But because that wasn't communicated back to the benchmark committee, it brings out some of these results that while there is a problem, that one is actually created by our responses. So we now do a better job of saying, okay, let's adjust that up to what a 1.0 is, and then that would make it apples to apples. So there's a lot of things to really look at because that is going to be a discussion that is going to continue to be had. And until that it results in equity between the two genders, it's not going to go away, and nor should it. And I think all you can do as an administrator is really to feel comfortable that if everything that you had became public, because things can become public, if you feel good about that information becoming public, you did your job. And you said, look, I did it the best way we could. Maybe people don't get paid the most because of financial constraints in your system or financial constraints in your college or department, but is it equitable? And are the right people who are doing the right jobs somewhat comparison to their colleagues? So I have a few takeaways after this slide, but I really wanted to give some time. I know we have about 18 minutes left. I wanted to allow for a lot of discussion because just because Travis does something at Northwestern, Kirsten did something at Brown, or I did something at Cincinnati. It's not the same. And a lot of you have very different kind of ways and systems, and we wanted to just give the opportunity for you guys to discuss those.
So thanks, Steve, so much for teeing this up. And I know it's a little challenging to do discussion on Zoom, but please, you know, come forth with your questions if you have any. I can hit the unmute all button, or you can just, I think you have ability to just unmute yourself individually here. If you're having difficulty with it. Oh, she had,
I now can.
Everybody.
I have a quick question. So you kind of talked about looking at your different shifts and the makeup and day versus night. And it's pretty easy to look like day versus night or location, but how do you like really dig into the details in terms of like number of APPs, residents? I mean, there are just so many different combinations that what do you kind of suggest focusing your analysis at least first on, besides like maybe location and kind of time of day?
Yeah, so Jillian, I think that makes it's a great question. To me, I have enough stuff to do during the day, and as a whole, it really starts at a very high level, in my opinion. Is your department as a whole meeting, because they do have these those exact same provider scorecards. They have one for your department, right? So as your department and how much you're working and how much patients you see clinically and work RVUs and all that stuff, what percentile are you at? And that really sets the bar, right? So if your department as a whole is doing really well, I have conversations with our leadership all the time. They focus on one person who's just, they love working the OB2 shift. It's a shift in our CDU. It's a night shift. People don't like it. People don't want it. But I got a few clinicians who love that shift because they get an extra few bucks, and it works with their home life, their kids, their spouse, whatever. I don't really care how it works. I'm just thankful that they want to work that shift. What I always explain to our COO is, yeah, I see you that she's not performing or he's not performing up to the 50th percentile. But again, you have the whole department is working above the 50th percentile. And even if I were to move somebody else into that shift, it actually makes the other faculty members more upset because no one wants that shift. And it would just pull down from them and raise this person up. So at the end of the day, why don't you let me run my department and get, to the over the 50th percentile? And if we're going to do it this way, it doesn't really matter because it's a seesaw. It's pulling from Peter to pay Paul. It doesn't make sense. And, the first couple of times I did that, I was also a very junior administrator and like 30. It didn't go over extremely well. Over multiple years of explaining it and showing that we consistently perform over the 50th percentile, it was just an argument that she didn't even want to have. She was like, you know what, you're right. She's like, just as long as overall you guys are looking good, I think we're fine. I really do think, though, if your APPs as a whole were reducing the amount of work RVUs that they were seeing, that's when you have to look at it and say, is it because they're not performing really well? Or because if it's just one person, maybe they're not feeling, how sometimes with Epic, you have to sign up for patients and they're just not as quick because the residents are super hungry, especially if you're at a very competitive program and everyone's trying to get those patients, and there might be boarding, there might be other things. Those are the type of things you really have to look at, is what are all those outside factors, and not always going to, well, people are lazy or people aren't performing well. I think it's usually those outside factors first, and those are a lot easier to explain. I always love to use boarding as the explanation because it puts it again in the front of the health system to say, if you guys had no boarding, you realize that would be 10 extra rooms in my ED, and 10 rooms doesn't mean 10 patients, because our finance guy, who I love to death, and he was a colleague of mine in MBA, he was like, well, that would have been 10 extra patients. I'm like, Bill, we see a patient like every 4 to 5 hours. So that would be like 5 to 6 patients that we could have saw in that one space times 10. And suddenly, as a finance guy, he's like, we got to get rid of boarding. I'm like, we got to get rid of boarding.
And the multiplier for hospital charges to our physician professional charges is about 10 to 1. So it's a much bigger issue on the hospital side of the house than it is on your practice plan.
So then in your CP, because we use that at Utah, and then they're also starting to use that here in Colorado. But when you're doing the CFTE, you're only using RVU generated CFT. Like if somebody was a medical director, you're not necessarily including that as a CFTE?
Absolutely not. So
okay.
What we do is there are, let me flip to it. So there's clinical billable, and then there's clinical non-billable.
Okay. Oh, so that's how you split it out.
Yeah, if they were, well, and there's research, education, and other sometimes it's administrative duties. We consider a medical directorship administrative duties. Clinical billable for us, we have a lot of medical director contracts for EMS division. So Cincinnati Fire pays us about $500,000 a year. So there's significant offload tied to all those things. So we consider that clinical non-billable, but then that doesn't adjust the work RVU component with it. So it's really important when you're doing either your salary declaration, your effort reporting, whatever system you have, to make sure that you really understand what you're putting in, because what you're putting in is very directly tied to the output that they're seeing in the CPSC benchmarking.
So we have about 10 minutes left. Are there any specific questions people have about other topics? I know there are a lot of COVID compensation considerations right now. Steve touched here on boarding. Boarding certainly does have a big impact on our ability to see new patients, generate RVUs before they leave without being seen. We have issues articulating that to our leadership and the impact that other areas of the hospital have on our ability to generate revenue. Any questions that people have?
So while you guys are thinking, I'll just flip to the last slide that I have, which is just basically takeaways from this. If I can leave you with nothing else, understand what your institution's philosophy model is. That to me is the first thing, because you're not going to change the institution. If the institution is focused on one way, you have to understand that, and then you have to adjust to that and have a discussion with your chair to see how much elasticity they have in that. Review where you're at. We talked about that cash cow and really looking at kind of where your department is kind of situated in that. If you are in the top right where you get paid a lot and you guys do a great job, that's important to know as well. Maybe you're not asking for more money, but maybe you're going to have to be answering some questions of why you guys get paid so much. Well, it's because we are very, very productive. If you're on anywhere on the left side, you should also know that, because you should start to plan, how are you going to answer those questions? How can we adjust that? How can we incentivize to make more part of your variable, maybe more part of your compensation variable, and assist that variation to where you guys want to be. Plan for the long game is a big suggestion I have. As a young administrator, I was like, we're going to change this. And then I realized very quickly, it takes time. There's not unlimited money. There's not unlimited hiring that you can do in 1 year. So think about, and to be honest, health system leadership and college leadership really is way more apt most of the time to look at multi-year plans. There is a variation of that. If you have a new chair coming in, shoot your shot. Talk to your new chair. Talk to when they're negotiating their chair package. I know a lot of chairs that came from our institution had a discussion with myself and my chairman before they left to go accept their offer, and they put together their request. And they said, look, we're overworked. We don't have enough, equipment. We don't have this, we don't have that. But out of any institution and any department, what's your biggest expense? It's the humans. So they really made sure that they built that into their request. It's funding for either offload, funding for education, funding for administration, or just funding at all to improve that base salary so they can recruit, and not recruit what they currently have, recruit the best emergency medicine clinicians that they could, especially academians. And then finally was make sure you be comfortable if this all became public, because I will tell you, people talk. They all went to residency together sometimes. They'll start communicating. Academic EM is a super small world, and we all know each other. And it's funny, you know, one of your residents comes and interviews at my place, and I ask how you guys are doing. And it's funny, like, they're like, you know each other? And we're like, we all know each other. So if it gets out, you got to be able to stand behind that. And I think that that's key, especially in this day and age where Kirsten and that team did a ton of great work regarding the gender disparity gap. And you might not like the results, but if you know the numbers and you know what you're doing the right thing.
Yeah, and remember, it's a great point. I mean, if things get published in the paper tomorrow, you want to feel like you could at least explain any differences that exist. This person has an administrative leadership position. This person has electively chosen to work more hours, whatever the case is. You want to make sure that everyone within the same shop is treated the exact same way. That does not mean, though, that everyone in different shops needs to be on the same compensation plan. Our academic shop and our practice community shop are treated very differently. And in fact, our academic shop does not have a subsidy from the hospital. So we are able to financially float ourselves based on our own billing and collections. And our community shop requires several $1 million from the hospital just to make it as a group. So inherent in that arrangement is, you know, a good many differences in bargaining power and in flexibility. So for us, it's important to make sure that all of our academic doctors are treated the same way and all of our community private practice doctors are treated the same way, but that does not mean that the two groups need to be treated the same.
Yeah, so the biggest takeaway is go back 200 years and put your hospital on Michigan Avenue is the biggest takeaway from that conversation.
Yeah. Well, but I think that that's true. And I think that I think you have to be really careful when you're doing your analytics. And, you know, I've done a lot of these. I did a lot at Brown. I've worked on several papers and we've worked on the analytics. And it's really important to make sure you're comparing the apple to the apple and not the apple to the orange. Steve touched a little bit on instructors. They can be very different at different shops. The instructors that were in the program at Brown were the community docs. Some of them had 25 years experience. So they had salaries that were reflective of those years experience and reflective of the fact that the community docs worked significantly more clinical hours per week. They were working 36 clinical hours per week versus 28. And that's huge. And so their pay was really very high when you look at instructors, but that's because they were different than an instructor in the Harvard program, which is how you go in and you're there as a very junior person. Our regular faculty always came in as assistant professors. And so you have to make sure you understand what are the differences between what you're doing at your place and what that kind of global thing is. And so you may need to parse the data a little bit differently as you're looking at it. And so looking at years of experience and rank and trying to see, okay, does our shop match up with what the benchmark is that I'm comparing to? And so just make sure you're careful about how you do those analytics and how you compare, because you really want to make sure that you are doing the correct comparison. And if you don't, you look at it and you'll say, what's going on here? How come we're paying this person so much more? It doesn't look right. Well, maybe it does when you dig deeper into it. You just got to make sure you're looking at the right level of detail. All right, so thank you, Steve, so much for that presentation on compensation.